Hi, everybody. It's Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's, what is it, June 26th today, and I am on my way to the Great Lakes Astrology Conference. I made a talk earlier today. I did a live stream, and it was super choppy. It didn't turn out very well, and I had a number of people email me asking if I could re-record the talk and try to do it with a more stable connection so that the talk would come through all right. So that's what I'm going to do. Basically, I wanted to do a talk today on the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that's forming in the sky right now, that has been forming for a little while, because I've been getting a lot of questions about it in relation to the upcoming eclipses, which are taking place in Capricorn and Cancer. You have Saturn and Pluto getting together right now in the sign of Capricorn. So the questions have gone something like this. Is it a big deal that we have eclipses taking place in the same sign that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is taking place, or the same sign axis? And the answer is, of course, yes. It is a big deal. It's a big deal whenever Saturn makes a significant planetary aspect with another slow-moving planet, basically from Jupiter all the way out to Pluto, in terms of our modern outer planets, as well as the traditional seven, Jupiter out to Pluto. Anytime it gets together with Saturn, it's a big deal. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about Saturn, a little bit about Pluto, what you can expect when they get together, and then what that means within the context of the upcoming eclipses. Not just the eclipses next month in July, but those that will come next winter when the sun starts moving through Capricorn as well. So one of the most important but little known things about Saturn is that Saturn was the ruler of time. When you or I think about time, mostly we think about it in terms of our clock. We think about linear time. We think about one thing moving from point A to point B to point C in a linear fashion, because that's how we experience change. And for the most part, when we think of time, we think of the standardized time of our time zone, our clocks, what our cell phones or cars tell us. And so we think of time as something that's uniform and that is the same everywhere. And we also think of it as very linear. But for ancient astrologers, time was incredibly diverse. And time was multiple, and time was also circular, not linear. There's a linear quality to time, right? It does move from past to present to future in a sense, but that's ultimately relative within the context of a never-ending circle, and a circle without beginning or end in any ultimate sense either. So you're thinking of the cosmos not as something that has any ultimate moment of creation or any ultimate moment of destruction, but as something that has its own eternal rhythm. It's an eternal cycling. And within that cycling, there are many different streams or rivers of time, many different epicycles, smaller cycles within cycles within cycles. So time was for the ancient mystics, it was thought of as both circular and as being something that featured many different kinds of time, cycles within cycles, all circles. And it was also something that was highly numerological. Different kinds of time involved different kinds of counting. Different kinds of counting structures were related to different, what we might today call fields of consciousness or dimensions of consciousness or experience. And so there's numerology related very intimately to the different kinds of time, different methods of counting. And those timekeepers, those methods of counting, are related to the planets. In fact, Plato tells us that it was the planets that and the stars that first taught human beings how to count. And so the planets are in some ways representative of different kinds of time, different measures or methods of counting. But you have to remember that this isn't just some kind of counting that occurs in a vacuum. The cosmos was also understood as inherently aesthetic, meaning beautiful, good, true, orderly, decked out with beauty, in fact. And so it's appropriate to not only think of the different kinds of time as cyclical, as many different kinds of time, epicycles within cycles, as never ending, as numerological, pertaining to different kinds of counting, but also that it was inherently musical. It was inherently rhythmic because it was also beautiful. So when we say that Saturn is associated with time, we have to, first of all, just take into our awareness that sense of time that ancient people lived with. Because today we've lost that. We say, well, that was an interesting time in my life. Or we say that was an interesting moment, or that was an interesting day. It felt like the time flew by, or it felt like time stood still. So we still have references to this ancient way of thinking about time, which is really natural. But we don't, unfortunately, now we think of that way of talking as whimsical. To ancient philosophers and mystics, it was not whimsical, it was factual. So, to talk about different seasons of time was something that was more real to them than in some ways it is to us. So we think it's a figure of speech to say that time was moving in a strange way today, right? People will just say, oh, you're sensitive, or oh, you're being poetical, or oh, you're dramatic, or oh, you took too many psychedelics or something, So we have to think about Saturn first in the context of all different kinds of time. Time is rhythm, time is music. Then what we have to understand is that major conjunctions with Saturn, representing a new beginning, anytime there's a conjunction, new beginning, will represent a new kind of time. Basically, any kind of conjunction will typically mean a change in the quality of time, a new era, a new kind of experience qualified by a different kind of rhythm or a different feeling that is almost like a music. This is why we call astrology the music of the spheres. So any conjunction is like that. But Saturn in particular, as the Lord of time, what does that mean? Well, as the Lord of time, Saturn represents a liminal space. Saturn represents a space that stands between times. So, for example, one of the classic figures related to Saturn is Janus, the dual-facing god that is related to time. A lot of people miss that Saturn is also the ruler of the golden age, right? Which is in an archetypal sense something that was ideal long ago, but has since changed or potentially devolved or has fallen out of power or fallen from grace or something like that. So Saturn has built into it this sense of something that was, something that has become, and usually some sense of what will be. Now, in that general notion, in a sense, we're talking about the experience of time. So the experience of time, regardless of which time signature, which type of season, or what type of era in your life you're living through, is similar insofar as there is a sense of something that came before, there is something that feels as though it is present, and there is some hope, expectation, longing, or fear of that which is to come, etc. So Saturn occupies the space where whenever we become reflective on the nature of time, when we start reflecting upon the past, when we reflect upon the present, or when we reflect upon the future, we are becoming, we're moving into a kind of liminal space. And that liminal space allows us to see the nature of the time that we're living in. It allows us to become reflective upon the season that we're in, the mode of time that we're living in. Now, why does Saturn occupy that place? Most of the time, people think Saturn is just the being locked into something linear. Most people will think of Saturn as structure and discipline and sternness and all of that kind of stuff. But really, that's not nearly all there is to Saturn. Saturn occupies the 7th sphere, which is the sphere of mystics. It's the sphere of contemplation. Saturn, as the dimmest, most remote planet in traditional astrology, has the ability to look upon everything that comes before it, right? Moving in down to us on Earth in the celestial spheres model. There's the Earth, then the Moon, then Mercury, then Venus, then the Sun, then Mars, then Jupiter, then Saturn. And in that celestial spheres model that the ancient astrologers were working with, Saturn had that bird's eye view of the whole thing. And what was beyond Saturn? The stars, right? So, something that is relatively more unspeakable is beyond Saturn. So Saturn occupies a place that's at the threshold between the known and the unknown. It sits at the threshold between the structures, paradigms, and let's say the laws, the operating laws of the material universe, and that which exists beyond them, which is in some ways more than what the mind can comprehend. You can't circumscribe that sphere of consciousness with your linear mind. Some people will say Saturn is the linear mind, but no, Saturn is not the linear mind. Saturn is the demarcation of the boundary between the linear mind and that which goes beyond it. And so, from that standpoint, it's very important that we understand that when we're in a Saturnine period of time, we're in a transitional space between structures, eras, boundaries, paradigms, operating rules, and different ways in which our experiences are organized and ordered. So when you're in your 20s, you might be in a mode of life where your experiences are ordered and structured in a particular way. As you age, which is a Saturnine process, you can become more aware of the eras in your life and eras within eras of your life, because with more distance, with more time, comes more perspective. And your memory, your comprehension of time becomes more nuanced. You can see the epicycles within the larger cycles. That's a function of aging for a reflective person. Not everyone has a great memory, but that's part of how we age. So when we say you're going to have a Saturnine experience, usually what we mean is, it's going to be about boundaries and discipline, and it's going to be a hard time and a depressive time and like that. And really, that's not what characterizes a Saturnine experience in a more fundamental way. The reason that a Saturnine experience can feel so harsh and severe, and the feeling of being limited or constrained can feel so intense, is because the other thing that Saturn rules outside of time or alongside of time is necessity. Necessity is the fact that let's say if you're clapping your hands and you find a rhythm, like a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4, like that, and just over and over. Once you find that rhythm and you get locked into it, right? 1 and 2 and a 3 and a 4. You could start feeling that rhythm in lots of different ways. 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 1, right? I'm making this up as I go, but you get the point. The thing is locked in. The rhythm is locked in. But the way you fill that rhythm, there's freedom, right? There's a certain amount of freedom. So similarly, periods or eras in our life are locked in, and that's necessity. That's the rhythm of time. And the rhythm locks in what kinds of potentialities and wiggle room and freedom there is within the structure. Got it? Now, when we say that you're having a Saturnine transit, depending on what kind of transit it is and to what planet and where it's landing in your chart, generally speaking, the ruling orders, structures, paradigms, in this case, a rhythm, is going to change. So that it might move from 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4, regardless of what you're filling that with, to a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 5, 6, 7, 8. 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 5, 6, 7, 8, right? Different rhythm, different structure. But once you're locked into that new rhythm, that's it. And then the new rhythm, you get to fill that. You have some free will, but that's the new law of the land, right? So similarly, both in India and in ancient Western astrology, the different kinds of rhythm codes or structures that rule our lives, they get locked in during Saturnine transits. This is why your Saturn return is such a big deal as well, because it's a huge 30-year cycle of Saturn that's coming around and completely reordering the rhythm, structure, cadence, that ruling beat per measure of your life, so to speak. I'm just using that as an analogy. It's obviously far more sophisticated than that. But what happens for us when we run into a time change, like that, is we have cognitive dissonance. We come in and we say everything's changing, and it feels as though the force of a new law, which has a new demand, right? It has a new demand upon us. And we don't know how to move around within that structure very easily sometimes right away. It's not so intuitive to us. If you have a nicely dignified Saturn, usually, especially an exalted Saturn in Libra, or even Saturn in Capricorn or Aquarius, typically you will understand the structures of new time periods better, and you'll adhere to them better. Some people, that you'll see them expressing Saturn in terms of doing really well with structures or boundaries, but this is what it means at a deeper level. And of course, you can go in the opposite direction, where rather than filling the space of a period in your life, of the rule of law, which covers many different areas of life simultaneously, you could be in a 15-year-long Mars period in the Hindu Dasha system, or in the zodiacal releasing system in Hellenistic astrology. And there's a rhythm to that system. And if you're too Saturnine, you're just going to be like, okay, 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 1 and just got to stick to it. Can't do anything unique here. Just got to stick to it. Okay, that would be like, sometimes we would, a lot of people stereotypically will think that's Saturn. That's actually not Saturn. That's just someone that doesn't realize that there's freedom within the structure, right? So whereas someone who has more ease and familiarity with the structure, this is why Saturn is exalted in Venus's sign of Libra, will find ease and harmony with it. 1 and a 2 and a 3, 4, 1 and a 2 and a 3, 4, right? There'll be some way of filling that structure with ease. They'll float along with it much easier. They won't struggle against it, because they realize that, these structures, these time signatures, they change. They come and go, and I've got to be attentive to them so that I can unfold what's inside of that time signature. So ancient astrologers were all about this. You have to remember that it comes down from the Pythagoreans. These are musical medicine people. You know what I mean? And also, well, at any rate, I won't go off on that tangent too much, but I'll just say this. When you're having a Saturnine experience, you're coming into a liminal space where you have the power to reflect upon the time signature. And then as the transit happens, a Saturn square to a planet, or a planet square to Saturn, or an opposition or a conjunction, especially the quadrature alignments, the conjunction square, opposition square, conjunction. When you have those moments, it's a harder time change. It's you're going from one kind of mode to another, and the transition can create this cognitive dissonance where you're like, I gotta change time signatures. It's a different mood, and it's a different feeling, it's a different type of music, and I don't know how to adhere to this governing program. And so there can be, you can feel constrained because some new law is enforcing itself. And you're like, oh, I gotta, because you have free will, so you have to figure out how to jive with that. But it has demands, like it's got a beat, it's going, So the hard aspects tend to be about the moments where we have that cognitive dissonance, right? We're like in between worlds, kind of fragging out, trying to figure out how to adhere to the new time system. When we come into a conjunction with Saturn, the mood changes. And then it's all about how do I, it's smooth. Generally speaking, it's smoother, right? And the liminal space is still there. You're still going to feel like you have a bird's eye view of your life. You're in reflection mode. Remember, Saturn ruling the seventh sphere of heaven is the place Dante names as the sphere of contemplatives in heaven. Contemplation, to contemplate, to be with something, to move around something. So to contemplate is a Saturnine thing. It's something that you do when you're on the threshold between worlds, when you're looking over from an objective standpoint. This is why Saturn is associated with death, which is the great bringer of objectivity. That's why the Buddha starts with impermanence and death, because death gives us that perspective. So when we look at the world from this view, we get kind of a bird's eye view, and we say, oh, and also the time signature is changing. The paradigm and its ruling demands on us are changing. That becomes a moment where we can take stock of, account for, learn a new way of counting our life, adhere to a new rhythm. And there's generally a couple of ways that people respond or react to Saturnine conjunctions, regardless of which planet it's with. And we're going to talk more about Pluto in a second. The first way that they'll respond will be to just freak out. I'm going to cling or try to hold to the program, the counting, the beat that I'm used to. Doesn't usually work so well and will lead to a imbalance, degeneration, sickness, death, etc. on different levels. Why? Because when you aren't following the rhythm of the cosmos and you're out of sync or you're out of beat, it's ugly. It's inherently offensive to our souls. And when our soul and our material life are out of sync, we're not living soulfully, we're not filling the rhythm with some soul, one and a two and a da 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 da. When we're not filling it with soulfulness, we're clinging to the structure itself like that. We can't do it. It's offensive to the soul. It's ugly, and we're being asked to come along with the beauty of the cosmos, but we can't. We don't want to. It's offensive. It starts hurting our heart. It starts hurting the soul, and that starts to manifest in terms of disease, all different kinds of disease. Disease systemically in terms of the field of our life. So now some people will say that the disease, the old structure, the old system is Saturn, but that's really a very shallow understanding of Saturn. That is one part of, or a potential reaction to, a Saturnine transit. But a Saturnine transit is not the old. It's not the clinging to the old. Saturn has to do with transitions between modes and seasons of time that bring up the tendency to cling to the past. But the other tendency that it brings up is the desire to create a new structure. It's not so much that we're creating a new structure as much as it is that we're finding new ways of adhering ourselves to the new time signature. And that in our life often looks like the building of new structures. But what it really is it's really a way of finding our step. We're finding out how to move along with that beat. And then, as always, the question becomes, can I fill that? How do I fill that with soul? Through our reflection, through our contemplation of these transitional spaces, we often come in touch with the soul and the need to animate our lives in some way. Another thing that people do not associate with Saturn. The reason that they don't associate it with Saturn is because they think of Saturn as death. They think of Saturn as decay or rigidity, like rigor mortis. They don't think, oh, Saturn comes along and breathes new life into things. But actually, in the material world, the world of death and regeneration, all moments in the process of death and birth, death, old age, disease, decay, death, rebirth, etc., they're all within the circle of time simultaneous to one another. In the same way that if you have a repeating stanza of music and you keep playing it, you soon realize that every note is co-present, and you don't see everything as linear and chunked off anymore. You see it as one grand cycle. Saturn, as the awareness of the circularity of time, is also, remember, a planet associated with mysticism. And it's associated with mysticism because when we start contemplating the totality of things, these transitional spaces also afford us the ability, in other words, to contemplate the totality of everything. And when we do that, it behooves us to go back into the sphere of life where everything feels very linear. And now we have the desire to fill it with more of a musical circular flow. This is why, for example, Ficino, the great Renaissance philosopher, who was a translator of the old sort of Platonic, Neoplatonic texts, and a great astrologer, told us that many astrologers and many great musicians and great artists were Saturnine, and that they were considered to be melancholics. What does that really mean? It means that some of the people who have the ability to connect the linear events in time together in a flow, right, are also those people who sometimes experience the most acute sense of separation from the world of time, which some people experience as very painful and sorrowful, but they will experience sometimes themselves in constant observation and reflection mode and need to distance themselves from the world. This is all Saturnine. But it's exactly that kind of Saturnine engagement with reality that allows us to step back into reality and fill it with something soulful. That's why depressive people are sometimes the most genius musicians. Sometimes the most depressive people who seem kind of like they're spaced out, or they're different, or they're alienated from the world in some ways, have the ability to find these eddies of creative genius that are just incredible. So Saturnine experiences give us the ability to fill for liminal spaces that come up. They indicate transitions in time, especially conjunctions, and they allow us the perspective to come back in and animate the rhythm with soul, with flow, with some kind of creative genius. But it comes from the distancing, the liminal space, the pain, the separation, the feeling of being excluded or of something hard or harsh happening that breaks the structure that you're used to. And then the reflection affords you the opportunity to enter into a new structure with greater coherence and lyricism, really. So that's a little oration on Saturn, which I was trying to do in the car today, but really it's just sort of sucked. So I couldn't find a rhythm because I was driving and I was just dumb. But I was bored. I was trying to find a way of being in flow with a long car ride. Anyway, so let's talk about Pluto. Now, I'm not going to say as much about Pluto because Pluto is in Saturn's home. So Pluto is aiding in this time signature change that Saturn is bringing about. Pluto is aiding in a liminal space that Saturn is trying to create for us so that we can step into a new paradigm in a different way. So how does Pluto do that? Well, first of all, Pluto, I said earlier today when I was driving, is like a gong. It's like bong, you know. It has this feeling of something really nuclear splitting open and then spreading out in a way that's really vast, right? Events that have far-reaching effect. In our lives, in our personal lives, that means those things that happen that end up affecting decades to come. And we always somehow reference back to them, like a little nuclear, you know, a nuclear plant in our life sort of exploded, right? A gong or a big stone being thrown into a pond and the ripples go really far outward. Pluto has that effect. Now, another way of thinking about Pluto is in terms of catastrophe, catharsis, cataclysm. All of the, you know, notice how they all have the CA in them, catharsis, catastrophe, and cataclysm. There's a sense in the ka of something being split open. One of the basic ways you could think about all of those words, catharsis, cataclysm, and catastrophe, is something that happens that has a way of almost like just something punching through the middle of, like let's use the rhythm analogy. You're moving along the rhythmic structure, 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. And right in between beats, not on a beat, but somewhere in between a beat, something blows out and completely saturates the rhythm structure, right? 1 comes right out. And as it blows out and through the structure, it also, there's a way in which it's like, well, you know, if you see a volcano just erupt and a mountain just blows apart, on the one hand, you're like, it's scary because there's a mighty structure that's just being split open. Saturn doesn't have to do with the structures being split open. Saturn is about the hard but kind of orderly changes of the time signatures, and it's rhythmic. Saturn is an order creator in that sense. It's hard to change during the hard transitions of Saturn, but there's still a sense of, you know, the necessity of the moment is leading to the change, and it might squeeze you and make it kind of tough. You got to make this change. There's a new paradigm, new laws, new expectations, and it's hard and it's contractive and difficult. It's not the same as Pluto. When Pluto comes in with Saturn, Pluto is helping Saturn create the time change by sending like a gong strike right in between the offbeat of your rhythm. And in that sense, it feels as though something is exploding out of nothing. Because the offbeat is something that, if you think about an offbeat when you're clapping, 1 and 2 and 3 and, that little and is automatic, right? It's automatic. So when something splits out of that automatic space, that kind of involuntary automatic space of our lives, and something just blows up in there, oh my God, you know, it can be very scary. When you see the mountain blast, it's like, it's scary, it's fearful, but it's also like, oh my God, it's like a supernova, something, it's a black hole, it's a star, it's some kind of amazing celestial event just bursting out of nothing, right? Pluto has that feeling, and we often talk about it bursting out of the depths. But there's a little too, that metaphor is so worn out. You know what I mean? It's like, oh yeah, it's like, okay, your pipes are gonna burst, and you know you're gonna barf, or you know something like, it's always like kind of shit flying up out of nowhere, but it's always kind of shitty and underworldy, and it, you know, like that. We have to think about underworld in terms of the celestial realm as well, not just someplace down in the bowels of, you know, your butt or something or something. You know what I mean? Like, you've got to think about it as like, what happens when there's some, either, you know, there's some cosmic flow that's happening out there in you know, if infinity, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in the midst of it, you know, an angelic rocket just blasts through, you know, in some completely unexpected space out of nothing, right? That's Pluto as well. So you have to think about Pluto as the tiniest little twinkle of an atom bomb right before it blows. It has this feeling of being little and almost incomprehensible, and it comes out of a place that you take for granted. That's part of what we mean when we say that Pluto blows up out of the unconscious. It's not just, you know, it's not just, oh, you know, it you know, it's something that's going to come up in your therapy session, you know, about your mom or something like that. It's a really deep, heavy emotional releasing. It's not, it doesn't always have to be so, in, you know, soap opera and boring. And we don't like that anyway. The soul is offended by boring things, right? So when something comes splitting out of the offbeat in your life, that involuntary space that you take for granted, it sneaks up and surprises you. It has the same impact of a crater being blown open, but you know, sometimes it feels more cosmic than that. It feels like it's something that is splitting open your understanding of reality. That Pluto has that kind of transpersonal, transcendental effect when it detonates. And when it does that, it has these long-lasting shock waves, and it's part of ushering in a time signature change. But remember that the time signature change, according to Saturn, is still going to be rhythmic. It's still going to be ordered. You're not just going to, you know, everything's not just going to go to hell in a handbasket. You're just not going to be total chaos. It's not going to be, you know, like a post-apocalyptic Walking Dead show or something. People think of it like that, but that's way too much chaos for Saturn. Saturn is going to usher in a time signature change, a changing of the guard, a changing of paradigm, of structure, of ruling program, so to speak, karmically. A season is done, a new one is beginning. That's orderly. That you'll feel the change, you'll feel the rhythm, and you will be guided by that structure, you know, to make a constructive change that you can adhere to with some organization. It's not going to be, you know, crazy chaos. It's not, you know, it's not going to, you're just going to start living in the rubble of some post-apocalyptic city or something. However, Pluto will help to create that change by creating a few really seismic blasts. And it's like something splitting out of a black hole. It's going to be out of the place and out of the time that you take for granted, or that's part of the involuntary breathing of your life. It'll emerge, a little sparkle, little wink, little diamond wink in the black, and then boom, it's just comes out. So Pluto, Saturn together in a conjunction are creating a time signature change that's like that. Okay, so all of that being said, now let's talk about what that means, given that there are 2 eclipses coming in July, and that there are greater eclipses coming next winter in Capricorn and Cancer, as Saturn and Pluto are making the conjunction. So first of all, when you have this eclipse taking place across the Capricorn-Cancer axis, you're opposing this time signature change, which has a lot to do with impermanence, death. You know, this is Capricorn and Saturn after all. Saturn's in its home sign here. You're opposing that to Cancer, which is the ruler of life and birth. So life and death situations can be pretty acute, especially meaning the changing of the guard can be more, let's just say, emotionally vulnerable. Whatever time signature change is involved, it may rip us away from things that we have grown really attached to. Parents, grandparents, family, home, the places that are sensitive for us, that are delicate. That's part of what Cancer represents. But don't worry, because, for example, on July 2nd, there's a solar eclipse in Cancer. What does that mean? It means that even as some of these changes are coming, cataclysm, catharsis, catastrophe, and they signify a time change, we're going to become reflective about things in the liminal space of Saturn. But we will also, if we tune into our emotional body and tune into the need that we each have to be at home, we will find a natural way of being guided toward the next phase in our life, a phase where we can take refuge, a phase where we can find shelter, a place that we can call home, a place where we can feel nested, safe, secure, something that we can nurture. The newness of the solar eclipses in Cancer are promising us that we will be guided through this by our instinctual body, which will guide us to the right thing that will help us feel safe, or that will help us cohere to this time signature change with a feeling of being safe and nurtured. Okay, so that's the good thing. However, one thing you have to be careful about, the dark side of Cancer is, I said this earlier today while I was driving, when an animal feels threatened, by something, it'll just run for cover wherever it can, right? And we may be tempted right now in a kind of fight or flight mode when difficult things come up. We can be tempted to make some really big extreme choices that are rooted in an impatient desire to find that homeostasis, to find that sense of being emotionally safe, to find a way into the new structure and call it home as quickly as possible. That doesn't always mean we make the best decisions. Sometimes we make a decision out of fear and the need for shelter, safety, or security, and we're not thinking enough in the long run about what creates shelter or security or health or well-being or nourishment, because we're operating out of fear, neediness. We're operating out of so we don't want to do that either. Somewhere in between, freaking out and making an overly emotional and impulsive decision to try and, move into the next phase of life as quickly as possible with as little difficulty as possible. They're just kind of freaking out. Somewhere between that and, on the other hand, not paying any attention to what our needs are during a time that could be very demanding, and a time where the changes happening may be a little traumatic, or they may require that we are very gentle with ourselves while making a transition. Somewhere in between, emotional freak out and neglecting our need for nourishment during a tough time, that's where somewhere right in the middle is our sweet spot. So the other thing that the Cancer solar eclipse can bring us is like listening and feeling. Like, let's say you're playing music and someone's leading the music, and then they change a time signature, their mood changes, everything like that, and you're on the spot, you're performing with a bunch of people, and you're like, I don't know what's going on here. They changed everything, and I gotta find a way of getting into this really quickly. If you rush it and try to do something really quickly, a lot of the times you're going to mess out and stand out. On the other hand, if you go, okay, so there's a change here, I'm just going to pause, listen, feel, there it is. And then we find our way of playing along again, right? So just that Cancer solar eclipse says something else can be born right now. All you got to do is listen, feel, use your instinctual body, and let that guide you. But got to pause enough to feel the difference between, between things, and avoid the temptation of making an emotionally impulsive decision in freak out mode. For example, I remember one that I made in my life, and I'll just share this with you guys. I remember when my wife got pregnant for the first time. I went into freak out mode because the time signature in my life was changing. And you better bet that this was a Saturn transit in my chart, right? so, so this was a Saturn transit, and I started going into freak out mode because I was like, oh, the responsibilities are changing. The program is changing. The time signature of my life is changing. And because I went into freak out mode about that, I was convinced, got to buy a house. Just white picket fence. I'm just going to start saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm going to wear a watch. I'm going to start tucking my shirt in. I got shit, like just total freak out. And I look back on that, and I look at how much more stress came into my life because of rushing through that experience. It turned out, for example, that the house that we bought, the process was very complicated. And I have no doubt that that was a karma that was there, because I was like rushing to try to create structures that can accommodate this new time change and try to create safety as quick as possible and like that. So now this event coincided with like 3 or 4 other events in my life that were all kind of cathartic and cataclysmic. And that was when Pluto was on my moon at the same time that I had a really powerful Saturn transit. So I draw on my own experience in telling these stories. The greatest gift that we have as astrologers, as people who like astrology, is not so much knowing what's going to happen. That's handy. It's nice but you're going to go through it one way or another, right? And you're going to learn from it no matter which way you go through it. Of course, the benefit of astrology is in going through it hopefully a little bit more mindfully or consciously. But the real gift of astrology is that as you go through it, no matter how you go through it, you have this amazing language that helps you to reflect upon all of it. And the more you do so, the more you start to understand the different natures of time, plural, natures. And when you understand the different natures of time, you can't help but see the music and the beauty of every different season of time in your life. That takes you beyond the karma. That takes you beyond the materiality. That takes you into a mood of reverence, devotion, love, awe, beauty, soulfulness. It inspires you to start filling the seasons with soulfulness. And that's really why Saturn is also a good planet for the process of studying astrology itself, as many astrologers have compared it with. So I wanted to say that at the end here. The only last thing that I'll say is that the lunar eclipse on July 16th, that's a lunar eclipse in Capricorn with Saturn and Pluto. That's going to be heavier. That's more of the thing jumping out of the offbeat. You know what I mean? So we'll brace ourselves for that. Not everyone experiences it the same. Some people experience it in their periphery, someone in their family, someone at work. It doesn't always have to be us personally, but that eclipse will bring with it more of that kind of experience. Because the bottom line is, I'm saying all of this, but not everybody listening to this is even really going to experience this transit in a particularly strong way. And that's because a lot of whether or not you experience transits like this really personally, or whether they take place more in the periphery of your personal life, has to do with what kind of season you're in karmically. And that's very different for different people. So that's what I've got for today. I hope that this was interesting. And as always, I hope that hearing this is I hope it's a little bit like cosmic church. I hope that you get a boost spiritually from this. Not that you're just sitting there going like, okay, well, now I know what's going to happen with Saturn and Pluto. Like, who knows? Do you know what I mean? Who really knows? I'm certainly not going to sit here and try to tell you that it's going to be fantastic. What I found is most useful about astrology is the way we can prepare ourselves for these transits by learning about the deeper meanings of each planet and each aspect and each thing that's involved. You go really deep into it, and it's more like yeah, it's not what's going to happen and predicting what's going to happen and just going on some crazy emotional new age roller coaster ride. It's more like yeah, I'm digging really I'm really going very deeply into like a theater performance. Like I'm just really locked in and really trying to understand what it is. The more we dive into what is astrology, what is Pluto, what is Saturn, like more like that, the more that the transit invites us to fill it with our own reflections. That's also something that Saturn encourages as its gateway planet between worlds. Not surprisingly, my moon is in the 9th house of astrology, full moon, lunar eclipse I was born under, and the moon was in the sign of Capricorn, which is Saturn's place. I have exalted Saturn conjoined with Jupiter in Libra, trine to my midheaven in Aquarius, ruled by Saturn. So, I mean, when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time in my basement, like thinking about stuff and writing about stuff and reflecting upon things. And I think a lot of people who like astrology are actually really similar, maybe engaged in the world, but there may be a part of you that's like standing on a metaphorical mountain, really looking at the stars quite a lot. So hopefully these kinds of talks help you to realize that there's actually a lot of us standing out there looking at the same stuff. So, okay, well, I hope you guys have a great week. I'm heading to the Great Lakes Astrology Conference tomorrow. I'll be giving a talk on Saturn and Pluto over the weekend and a couple of other talks as well. Maybe I'll post some of those on YouTube at some point. Take care, everyone. Bye.